Welcome to this video tutorial all about William Blake. This is designed to support students studying Blake as part of their A-levels. And in this poem, I'll be looking at the Innocence version of the Chimney Sweeper, which was first published in 1789 and then combined with the Experience poems in 1794. This tends to be a popular poem of Blake that students tend to enjoy analysing, I think because it deals relatively simply with a number of key themes that Blake was concerned with at the time. So the poem is told by a chimney sweeper himself, a young chimney sweeper. His father has recently sold him to a master into that kind of work, and his mother has recently died. So there's the inference here that the family is probably in poverty, and the father has to do whatever he can in order to make sure that they have food on the table. Despite the terrible conditions that the speaker endures as a chimney sweep, the child has a dream which features an angel, and that dream, symbolically at least, sets the child free from the constraints of their everyday lives, providing a degree of escapism and allowing them to carry on the next day with this dreadful work with resilience. For AO3, which usually is social and historical context, of course, with literature we cannot separate the text from the context in which it is written, because literature is a mirror to society at the time. So for context here, a high degree of social realism, as you might expect, with a social and political protest text. Lots of children at the time employed as chimney sweeps. The working conditions were terrible, as you might expect, with the number of injuries and afflictions that you could get by being in close proximity with soot and other toxic material all day. You could also be crushed because of the confined spaces of chimneys. And of course, at this time, real fires were much more common than they are today. In fact, houses now don't tend to be built with fireplaces at all. My house doesn't have one, for example. It doesn't even have a chimney. So, back in these days, it was common. Back in those days, it was common for every house to have at least one chimney, because there would usually be more than one fireplace as well to keep the house warm. So lots of chimneys needed lots of sweeps, and it was children that often were those sweeps. Children effectively became slaves because they worked long hours and had poor living conditions, even when they weren't working, because the masters would often beat them if they rebelled and did not do as they were told. They would often sleep on the floor and were given relatively poor food. I'm thinking here Oliver Twist-like, although that's a few years later. So all in all, not a great reality. And this is, of course, what Blake is angry about. You might say quite rightly. He's incensed, he's livid by the way that society is treating these children and how institutions like the church and the government are doing very little to help them. Again, it's another poem which presents children as victims. Just to show some images, and I think the two, well, they're all pretty moving actually, they're all pretty poignant here. I believe that the photographs on the left-hand side are from the Victorian era, suggesting that even many years after these poems were published, we were still employing young children as chimney sweeps, right up until the Victorian era. You can just see the size of these children, very, very small, very young. No wonder they were needed to sweep chimneys because of their size. And you can see on the right-hand side there in that cartoon, yes, it's a cartoon, but also I do think it's very moving, emphasising how cramped it was and how miserable. And I also find it interesting that the chimneys in the background of that image look like people with top hats. So I don't know if that's also a commentary on how it's the richest chimneys that are being swept by poor chimney sweepers. I don't know if that's another comment there. So here is the poem. Again, I would encourage you to have the poem in front of you in paper format, ready to make annotations if you haven't already. So that's the poem that we're working with, 6 stanzas. So let's have a look at the first stanza then and start to make some annotations. So the child begins by saying, "When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep." So really here we're told that the father sold him to a master to earn a living. The family were probably in poverty. Think about how we view the father here. Do we view the father as responsible for their child's suffering? Or do we also feel sympathy for the father in the idea that he didn't really have a choice, perhaps? Think about how Blake is presenting the parent-child relationship here. A number of poems by Blake are to do with the relationship that children have with an adult, whether that be a caregiver like a nurse or a parent, as in this poem, or others. So think about how Blake is depicting here that parent-child relationship. On that third line, we have that adverb scarcely, which suggests that the child is very young because they can hardly speak. So that suggests that they are still, very, very young indeed. I think as well the fact that the child is the speaker, we've got that homodiegetic perspective here. It's very personal, very poignant that the speaker is the victim. We've got that epizeuxis of weep, 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 weep. Epizeuxis is a very kind of concentrated form of repetition. So it's a technical term for intense form of repetition. You might want to just look that up. But epizeuxis there, really reinforcing the child's misery and anguish. Notice we've also got the word your. So your chimneys I sweep. So who is that directed towards? It could be, for example, the wealthy elite, as we spoke about earlier. And the child is really consumed by their misery through the soot, for example. We're told, for example, that the child sleeps in the soot, which could be metaphorically seen as tarnishing and eradicating that innocence. But also, you can't get clean. And this is true, in fact, that when you are constantly working with dirty material, the filth actually gets into the pores of your skin. Like a tattoo, and it's very difficult to get out again because it permeates into your skin. So there's that sense that even when they're not working, they cannot escape that soot. It kind of follows them around. And I've also got the long vowel sounds of sweep and sleep. Again, maybe suggests it recreates the sound of that sweeping, maybe, or emphasizes the misery that they are feeling. As we move into the second stanza here, the child continues, "There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, 'Hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair.'" So Tom Dacre is named. So there's a degree of personalisation here. It's worth bearing in mind that the chimney sweeper in Experience, the counterpart to this poem, nobody's named. So in this poem it's different because we have names. And we have, as is the case often with Blake, imagery of a lamb, and a lamb of a symbol of sacrifice, innocence and purity. It's as if these children are being sacrificed in the same way that a lamb might be sacrificed for its wool, and the way in which a lamb is shaved, for example. So just like a lamb has to lose its coat, its wool, these children their heads are being shaved, suggesting that they firstly have lost the power, but they're being exploited, and they're also being victimized as well. The dialogue here is what the speaker says to Tom Dacre, and I think the speaker here is trying to make Tom Dacre feel resilient. So despite Tom's hair being shaved, and despite, waking up every day to take part in this miserable job, the words that the speaker is saying to Tom is supposed to give Tom some resilience, trying to say, you'll get through this, trying to be a comfort. And really saying that now your head's bare, it's a good thing because it means that you're not going to get dirty by the soot. Your white hair is not going to be blackened by the soot. And again, you've got that contrast, that binary between black and white here again, that we've seen in other Blake poems as well. So the fact that he's had that hair shaven, that white hair shaven, of course, is perhaps symbolic of relinquishing that innocence in preparation to enter the world of to enter the world of experience. So there's a degree of inner resistance here that despite losing that hair, they're trying to comfort each other and pull each other through that reality. Of course, when children are born, sometimes, particularly if they're blonde or fair-haired, children can actually be born with very white hair, which then turns darker as the years progress. So the fact that his hair is white might also be reinforcing the child's age as being very, very young indeed. As we go into the third stanza, we then get talk of the nighttime. And we've got an important image in this poem of these coffins of black, which I'm going to go to first. That thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. So again, that metaphor of the coffin is referring to the chimneys, these very kind of constrained, oppressive, claustrophobic places where the children are working. The chimneys therefore become metaphorical tombs of that suffering. The fact that they're locked up as well suggests that they have no choice. It's almost as if there's no democratic choice at all here. It's almost like a tyranny or tyrannical or somehow draconian, restrained. Notice as well we have that number thousands. So we're not just talking about one chimney sweeper or even 10. We're talking about thousands. So this is not a one-off situation. This is a collective suffering of many, an epidemic of suffering, and therefore the church or the powers that be are not stepping in at all to change the situation. In fact, according to Blake, probably they're just stood with their arms crossed waiting for their chimneys to be swept themselves. So, you know, that kind of complete uselessness of higher institutions. Nighttime, reminiscent of dreaming and sleeping. It's maybe a form of escapism. The fact that we have named chimney sweepers here, Dick, Joe, Ned and Jack, suggests that there is, again, an identity that's also afforded to Tom Dacre as well. And you could also argue as well that when they're sleeping, it could be a euphemism for death, as if Blake is suggesting that the only way to escape this terrible degradation and dystopia is to die. And that's quite a dark idea. But it's also perhaps where Blake's power comes in this message of this poem. Into the next stanza, we then get the angel. And the angel is the one that comes around with a key to set them free from their suffering. Again, there's a degree of hopelessness here because they don't have this key and this escape in real life. It only exists within the confines of the dream. So again, it's this idea that perhaps this utopian paradise that they dream about is only an illusion and doesn't bear any resemblance at all to their real life waking existence. The key, of course, is the antidote to feeling trapped. You use a key to open a door, for example. So if they're feeling trapped in a chimney, then the key is going to set them free from those chimneys. So it's a contrast to the image of the coffins of black again. It releases the children from their grim existence. Notice as well, this is the only stanza in this poem where we get reference to the green world. It's a common thing in the Innocence poems, but not this one. So in that dream, they are leaping in a green plain, they're laughing, they're washing in a river, they're shining in the sun. So here we get that harmony with the green world and the pastoral. The moment of happiness and jubilation is mirrored with the reference to the green world, and also the verbs leaping, run, shine, wash. They're all very positive compared to the claustrophobia and filth of the chimney, particularly wash, meaning to cleanse of the soot and the suffering, perhaps. Running, of course, and leaping is the opposite of being trapped. You can't run and leap in a chimney. There's no room. And again, it also reminds me of lambs, of newborn lambs that you sometimes see in March and April in the fields, skipping and running around, looking very cute. So again, perhaps it's reference to that lamb metaphor as well. Shining in the sun, it could be a metaphor, a euphemism for death. Is the speaker suggesting that paradise will only be reached after death? Is this kind of heaven, in other words? Is this a depiction of heaven and hell, maybe, going on? But again, Blake, the pessimism perhaps suggesting that in real life, society won't permit them to have this kind of existence. So they've only got to dream about it and wait for the afterlife, maybe, where they will be rewarded, perhaps. Moving on, we've got the adjectives naked and white, again suggesting a degree of purity here, and also a degree of being exposed and perhaps being fragile. They leave their bags behind, their work bags, these heavy bags with these big brooms in and God knows what else. So they're unburdened, they're not restrained or weighed down by these large work bags. They rise upon the clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. So the angel again said to Tom that, if you are a good boy, then you would have God for a father and you would be rewarded in the afterlife for it. So you could argue that this dream allows the children to get up and carry on with their work dutifully, despite knowing that it's going to be an awful experience. So perhaps the satisfaction of having God's love in heaven is a motivator for these children to carry on and get up in the morning, in the dark, and carry on dutifully. You could also argue perhaps that the angel is symbolic of the restrictive nature of religion, perhaps. So you've got that contrast between the dystopian reality and the utopian vision of freedom reinforced by the dream, perhaps, as well. And in the last stanza, we have the resolution to the poem. After the dream, Tom woke up. He gets up in the dark, again, which contrasts with the whiteness and the light of the dream, and the sun shining in the dream, for example. Again, this light and dark going on, white and black going on in this poem, a bit like the little black boy in that poem as well. The fact he's getting up in the dark with his bags and brushes to work, again, dutifully. Perhaps Blake is suggesting that the hardships that we feel that we have are all in the mind. Perhaps we need to get more resilient. And if we get resilient, we can get through things, perhaps, which is what these children seem to be doing. And the last two lines of the poem, though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. Again, you've got cold and warm opposites here, as if the dream has given them a new sense of comfort and resilience to face the day, despite knowing that it will be a dystopia experience. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. So again, the question here is, what do we make of that word duty? Is it a genuine sense of duty? Or has the child's innocence and naivety misled them? Have they been set up to fail almost? Is it a false sense of duty? Is this poem evidence that the oppressed and vulnerable can be mind-washed into thinking that they have duty, even though they're actually being exploited? So maybe they fail to see that because they have been conned, so to speak, into believing that they have some kind of duty here, perhaps. So this is a poem which students tend to like analysing. There's lots of nice words and language devices going on here, which links very nicely to context as well, and the social realism of these chimney sweeps, of course. This is something real. It's not something imagined. This is the reality of Blake's society of the time and his subsequent societies afterwards. And that's what Blake is reacting against as this kind of libertarian, as almost this social commentator. So he's seeing all of this injustice around him and saying that we're doing nothing to help these children. It's an indictment on our country that this is going on. We should be doing something. The government should be doing something. The church should be doing something. So that is the Chimney Sweeper from Innocence. And please look out for a separate video for the Chimney Sweeper for Experience.